welcome to Short Story Boudoir. My name is Samantha Neugebauer.
And I'm Katy Gathright.
And this is second season. This is our...
happy season 2.
Thank you. Happy season 2 to you as well.
Thank you.
So today we're going to talk about James Salter's story, American Express. And this is an exciting story for us because much like the Lahiri story we did last season, this is a story that encompasses basically an entire lifespan, which is different than a lot of the short stories that we've talked about on here. This story comes from this collection, Dusk, published in 1988. And it's the story of Alan and Frank, who are lawyers. They're attorneys. When we meet them in the beginning, they're young. They're kind of in their prime of their life in a way in New York City. And by the end, they are in their late middle age, we think, in Italy on vacation. As always, we will be doing a spoiler, plenty of spoilers.
Spoiler rich.
Yes, spoiler rich episode. So please read the story if you haven't yet before you listen to this episode. So this story is also often considered a modern classic for the kind of unique way that it handles tense, structure, and pacing to really capture what time feels like at different points in our lives. So I guess that's a good place as any to start.
Yeah.
I'm really curious, Katy, what you think about this story's asymmetrical structure and how you describe it and what that reading experience was like for you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think reading experience wise, I maybe knew from you or just from the air that it was going to be kind of an expansive story, that it was going to kind of cover multiple decades. And so I would say I was a little bit prepared for that, but I can't say I was prepared for the way time felt or moved, which is really interesting in this story. It does span, multiple decades. It's not interested in giving equal time to equal decades. In fact, some scenes are long and you spend a lot of time in, one evening in their lives. And then without even so much as a, piece of blank space, you're in another
line break
decade. And I do find that to be very disorienting, like honestly, as a reader. As a writer, it seems it's how freeing, you could do whatever you want. As a reader, I think it's disorienting, but I liked it, and I think this story feels interested to me in nostalgia, and I think that whenever you're moving on from one episode of life to the next, I think because they happen so fast and so seamlessly, it's sort of like the tone is kind of pretty similar throughout. So you sort of feel like you have that experience of like, all of a sudden I'm middle-aged, which maybe it's not that profound of a thought, but I do think that's what he's trying to capture a little bit. Like one day you are 25 in the bars, and the next day you're 45 in the bars.
You're your parents' age.
Yeah. How did it strike you?
I didn't know what to expect when I first read the story going in, so I thought, we spend a lot of time when they're sort of establishing their careers, when they're dating, or at least, ogling women in New York in kind of this Mad Men era. And then all of a sudden, one of them is divorced or is divorcing, and we didn't even know that they had married. So you're getting jerked around a bit, but it's so satisfying because you almost feel like, you're treated with your intelligence, is respected. Like, you can keep up with this guy, with this story. And then there is this long interlude that lasts until the end where they're on this trip to Italy, and I kept kind of waiting for that pace to pick up again. Like, I didn't think that we were going to kind of lull around Italy for the rest of this story.
Me either.
I mean, I absolutely think the story is a masterpiece, but it definitely caught me off guard, and I kept waiting. They have kind of more time, seemingly, a little bit more money, more freedom, more confidence in some ways than they did in their youth. And I kept waiting for, like, the speed to be exciting and exhilarating again, like the beginning. And no matter what they did, it wasn't.
Yeah, and it feels like one of those like moments where you're like, oh, right, because no matter what they do, like they're never going to recapture their earlier lives, you know.
Yeah.
And the story is like totally willing to like, let you be intelligent and let you kind of feel what the characters are feeling, I think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
Yeah, and I mean with the, you know, some of those like being jerked around, like the POV is also very interesting here too, because, you know, it bounces kind of back and forth between Frank and Alan, and at some points it doesn't really feel all that interested in distinguishing between them a lot of the time. We get actually like a couple of sentences in the kind of two primary women's POVs. Like it'll even dip into their POV really quickly and then back out. So yeah, I mean, I think the story is like much more interested in sort of like giving you the experience of aging than necessarily giving you the experience of reading a story.
Right, and it's sort of almost making this statement about, you know, the one character is like from the Midwest, but also the son of a lawyer. And the other kid is like grew up in New York City somewhere, son of a lawyer. And probably to them, especially in their youth, I'm just assuming because we're not told this, these were like important distinctions. Yeah. But that's not what this story is about. In fact, like these men might have these like, you know, distinctions that are important in their lives, but like on a cosmic level, like don't matter at all.
Totally.
And that I think is really, really interesting. And I feel like, you know, this story doesn't seem like it's not, it hasn't inspired a lot of other stories, I feel like, or maybe it has, I just don't know of them. But it's such like a fruitful way to explore the human experience. Like I almost want to read all like the people that are creating derivatives of this story and see what they come up with.
I mean, I feel like a much more like popular or common way to tackle time like this is to be more like vignette style, right? It's to have like a series of like short snippets, right? Or where like, they are disjointed and maybe you are disoriented and there aren't a lot of time markers, but the vignettes themselves feel very like discrete and kind of pulling you through time. This is not like that. It's almost like reading like one long fever dream of a life. It's actually very, very connected. It's like the opposite of like discrete moments. Which I agree. I don't feel like I've read a lot of other things that feel that way. It's almost like, I mean, you brought up Mad Men. It's almost like when I think about like Mad Men in retrospect, having watched like 7 seasons, it's almost like how it feels to be like, oh yeah, I know there were like episodes, but it was all kind of just about this guy.
Right,
you know?
Absolutely. It's very imagist in that way, right? It's so colorful in my mind, this story, and yet I don't know, like if we ever really linger in too many. We're not getting lines and lines of descriptions of anything. No, but when he does deliver a description, he will like pack a little punch. And I think so many of the good, well, they're really scattered throughout, but a lot of the good images are in the like Italy section. That's sort of like back half of the story. And I'm just curious to know, like, you know, this is a story called American Express. We start being so grounded in this like New York lawyer life. And then kind of again, the asymmetry of it is that so much of it then takes place in Italy as they're, well, Europe and then Italy as they're kind of touring around on this vacation, and it ends there. So it sort of feels like, oh, you spent a lot of time in Italy. I'm just curious what you make of that, or why you feel like that choice was appropriate here. Yeah, I think that there was no indication early on that Italy was like a goal for these men. Like, you know, we're gonna take this great, you know, even Europe trip at some point. It did feel to me, in some ways, like a product of its time. In terms of, like, nowadays, I think post Elizabeth Gilbert, etc., you know, you get, you know, I need to find myself, like, I'm having some kind of middle age crisis, I have the means to, you know, go to India or whatnot. And I wonder if in some ways, like, at that time, the Europe vacation was the vacation on the hill.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So partially my brain was there, and then partially I was just thinking about, what kind of stereotypes or preconceptions these characters might have about the Italian way of life and how it's different than their own way of life, and so that might have been attractive for them too.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I was thinking about the difference between time and space. So by like changing your space, maybe you're hoping to recapture time instead of new space, but it doesn't really work like that.
Yeah. No, I think I agree with all of those, and I do think there's something about like you go on a vacation or you go somewhere with hope, right? Or like with some kind of, whether it's like a hope to change your life or just a hope to be re-inspired or like a hope for something. And I think something that does come through in this section is that like that's not quite coming together for them. Like, like they might be sometimes having fun, but it's not an answer, the Italy trip, to any questions that they are having. And so I think you're right about something about like changing your space doesn't change time. There's something kind of futile about that, where it's like even in Europe or like everything that has led them to where they are is still true in Italy.
And I don't know if it would have mattered if they went to Shanghai.
Right? Yeah.
Like, I don't think so.
I don't think so either. I think, I don't know, I also get that you said imagistic. Like, I think he's interested in images, and I do think it is just true that you can, like, play with different images in a different setting, and that feels like it helps keep the story, like, bright and lively in a way.
And I think we would have felt something pathetic about them taking some like holiday or slowing down the pace in New York. Like revisiting these places that they went in their youth. It would have been too pathetic, honestly.
I think you're right.
So I think this was a really smart move.
And that's actually really astute.
Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit from the foreword of this edition, which is the 2011 one. And in this edition, Philip Gurevich writes this about Salter. He was handsome, and he had style. He lived in Europe. His prose announced itself with a high modern elegance. He made language sparse and lush all at once. Strong feelings made stronger by abbreviation. Intense physicality haunted by a whiff of metaphysics. For everything that is described, even more is evoked. First of all, that's a great tribute, right? And secondly, what caught my eye about this was that line about a whiff of metaphysics. And admittedly, I recently finished the book Liberalism as a Way of Life by Alex Lefebvre. And one of the points he makes in that book is that we're ensconced kind of in this liberal sensibility right now, which means that we have a very vertical morality. We no longer have a vertical morality. Our morality has become flat and very horizontal, so that our way of being a good person, of being a good moral person, is just essentially to do good to other finite beings who are also kind of on this horizontal plane than us. And he actually gives us an example, A Good Place. Have you watched that show? Kristen Bell. And so he talks about this as being a great example of a post-metaphysical show and a post-vertical show, because while Kristen Bell is kind of running around trying to figure out how to be a good person, there's never kind of questions of what am I? What is this place? And so this story, if it has these whiffs of metaphysical, of something, that a lot of our fiction and our art maybe doesn't have anymore, kind of in these liberal Western spaces, I'm curious about, did you smell these whiffs? Like, where did you find them, if at all?
I thought this was such interesting framing, and so hopeful for this story and kind of parsing why it's satisfying, because I do think the story is like not, it doesn't seem to be super interested in like, are these men good people?
Right.
Or like if the story like wants to go there, it's like, sure, that is like one of many questions you could ask. And I think that really comes into focus with like the Ida kind of plot at the end, when they're sort of pick up this schoolgirl in Italy and have this sort of like icky,
little like escorty.
Yes, yes. Icky twosome and threesome experience with her. And I do think, like, in some ways you can read that as just like, oh, the story just wants to be subtle about its morals. Like, it just, like, you know, wants to give you room to think about. It doesn't want to say, like, oh, these men are sleazy or, like, bad or, like, taking advantage, because, like, you can think about that for yourself. Okay, sure. But I think it's also partly because the story is interested in creating some breathing room for some of these, I won't say larger questions, but just like adjacent questions, which is like, what are they doing in Italy? Like, why are they there? Like, what are they hoping to achieve? Like, what do they think their purpose is? Like, and so I do like, because I do feel like the writing creates room for those bigger questions. And I, again, not bigger, just different.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I can like say how exactly he does that.
And I wonder too, like in, you know, craft essays or, you know, in classroom spaces, you'll absolutely, you know, hear people repeat that short stories, you know, can encompass the same amount of, say, characters as the novel, etc. And, you know, it's a smart idea to kind of zero in on like kind of maybe smaller ideas or cut the fat basically in the stories. And I wonder if one of those considerations that you can make then is cutting either this vertical or this horizontal kind of morality that you're interested, like, is it just more of a prioritization? And it's one that we're not used to seeing a lot in fiction anymore, at least.
No, I agree, because it feels, I do think the story feels like very vertical morality. Like, I think it's not just like, are these men good or bad? It's like, how good, like, you know, like there's like a lot of like degrees, like how much have they disappointed the people around them? Like how close are they with Brenda actually in a positive way? Like, I don't know, kind of interesting that they're all traveling together like these decades later. How interesting that these men actually are very close to one another.
Absolutely.
And have like, I would say like a real bond. That is sort of like an interesting thing that kind of throws other things into whack in the story, where it's actually quite, you know, tender their relationship. And so, I don't know, maybe it still feels like an ambitious way to write a short story.
It does, and
to me,
I think we haven't discussed any Joy Williams stories on this podcast yet, but I think we have intentions.
It's only a matter of time.
But I do think that you're getting some of these whiffs of the metaphysical in her work as well. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there is a huge overlap between people who like this Salter story and other Salter stories and Joy Williams' work.
Yeah, well, I guess we're already kind of...
Exactly.
I know, I agree. I mean, I think like along with this question of morality, I'm interested in like judgment in this story. And like, did you agree that like you're not called upon to judge the men, or do you feel like the story creates a lot of room for judgment?
What I liked was that it almost freed space in my mind to think about other things rather than judging these men.
I know.
Right? Because I think especially as time moves on and we kind of know what gender dynamics were then, you know, we want to go down those roads again. We want to revisit these places, but we want to do it in a way that, again, our intelligence is honored. You know, and that's really how I felt reading this story. Like, you get what they're like. So what else can we say about this time and these people? you know.
It's almost like I know that you know that you've all seen men
Yes.
on women in bars.
Exactly,
And, like,
you know.
pick up women decades younger than
Exactly.
them. Yeah, I totally agree. And I do, it's like, I'm curious about whether that feels transgressive or not. It almost feels like it's not like the story being transgressive, it's more like we kind of get to be transgressive.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
we get the choice to like not linger on that or to like be trusted that like at another time, another place, like you will think about predatory sexual relationships a lot.
Yes.
That you like don't have to do it here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that you know, in that way, we talked about Madeline a little bit. It does that too, right? Like, and I think in some ways, a lot of our, you know, best television shows of late do this better sometimes than fiction.
Yeah.
So I think it's a nice reminder to see, oh, like,
I know.
fiction writers do this too.
Yeah.
It's just not as common, maybe.
Yeah. It feels so unscripted, the
Yeah.
story, which I love.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of it is possible because the writing is so good.
So good.
So, as always, we'll probably talk about our favorite lines. And you did steal my favorite lines, but I will share other language that I'm equally excited to share. So, this is a section I like. This is while they are in Italy, and I believe this is like right after or like maybe like right before they pick up Ida, kind of before like that kind of last series of events in the story. Okay, so it goes. It was at the time of a famous murder in Poland, the killing of a priest. Dusk was falling. The lights were coming on in shop windows and evening papers were in the kiosks. The body of the murdered man lay in a long coffin in the upper right corner of the Corriere della Sera. It was in clean clothes like a worker after a terrible accident. So, I mean, this is like a very like, sort of like tangent, or like an aside moment, right? Where like, all of a sudden we're kind of being told about this murder in Poland. Like, they're not in Poland. It's sort of like a little bit random and indulgent. But I loved the mood that it establishes.
Absolutely.
And sort of like, without sort of saying that, oh, there are long shadows where they're sitting. You know, I think it's like finding an image or like a moment or something to describe that is like relevant to the mood he wants to create, but not, you know, on the nose, right? And the other thing this made me think of was, you know, I thought about Room with a View a little bit. Like, it made me think of, you know, they're in Italy, and it sort of made me think of that like stabbing that kind of kicks off the plot in A Room with a View, and this sort of like unsettling, like bloody thing, like a murder or stabbing, and kind of like what that does to the people around it. And it sort of felt almost like a purposeful homage to that, maybe a little bit. So I liked the feeling, the echoes of that in the story.
I like that too, and I like the idea of kind of leaning into this British tradition in that way, because there is that kind of British story, or that British novel where they are going to Europe, right? Yeah. And you just don't see that as much in American fiction, right? So it is neat to kind of maybe do something with that, but I have to kind of think on it a bit more.
But it fits with your description of Salter from that intro, that he was...
Yes, exactly. You know, he spent time in Europe, right? Okay, I'll say my favorite line,
go for it.
Which is, you know, gorgeous. So these are the opening lines, okay? It's hard now to think of all the places and nights. Nicola's like a railway car, deep and gleaming. The crowd at the A du Trois, Billy's, unknown, brilliant faces jammed at the bar. The dark, dramatic eye that blazes for a moment and disappears. So, you know, this opening, of course, immediately brought to mind Pound's, you know, very short couplet poem in the station of the metro. Just the way that it is kind of harnessing ephemeralness, and you feel in movement in there. And also, I don't know about you, but, you know, when I think back on my youth, which, you know, I was in New York for undergrad, and it's just like that. It's just like, I would hate to actually take a piece of paper and be asked to list out all the nights I remembered, because it's so much better in the aggregate.
I know.
Right?
It's so good.
And youth is like that for everyone. I think,
I mean, I
where
think
you spend it.
I think it's true. Like, you read that and you're like, it's like exactly the kind of like heaviness of like remembering being young. I mean, I'm not that young anymore. Right. Just like thinking, but I love it too, and it's just so like bold. I think like we've had conversations, I think, with friends before about like, you know, Salter, like he really has like, he just kind of goes for it, and is like unafraid of that like naked image that I think I would like.
There's something sexy about this too, and he's kind of known for that, right? Writing very sexy scenes, which this book didn't have quite, I think, anything, you know, too overtly sexual.
Yeah. But you can see why these women wanted to hang, like,
absolutely,
you see it all, and feel it kind of all. And like, you know why Brenda's there. And it all works.
I absolutely agree.
In the way, if you like Mad Men, you should read this story.
Absolutely read this story.
Well, thank you for chatting about it with me and kicking off season 2. We're excited to be back. Bunch of exciting stories in the can for us to talk about, but I think we will move on to eating our treats. And like and subscribe.
All the good stuff. And we'll see you next time. Ciao.
Take care.